My dear brother, I better remember to say, my dear senior brother. I want to thank my brother who gave a bit of my CV in introducing me, except to make him realize that when I was in politics in Nigeria, when I go to occasions like this, and the people who want to introduce me are members of the opposition, they will start by introducing me as General Obasanjo, just to show that I am a dictator. And if they are members of my own party, they will introduce me either as President Obasanjo or as Chief Obasanjo. Well, I saw that you do the mixture, so which means you are neither on the side of those who are members of my party or on the side of the opposition, because you refer to me as president and then you refer to me as general. So I was reminded of the South African and indeed the African philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because you are. It is true that we become the people we are through the reality of the environment into which we were born. And so it is there that I shall start. In April 1906, Mr. Pixley Kaseme gave his moving speech calling for the regeneration of Africa. In that speech, he said, and I quote, "From the four corners of the earth, Africa's sons, who have been proved through fire and sword, are marching to the future golden door, bearing the records of deeds of valor done." End of quotation. I draw upon these words from Mr. Seme for two reasons. This great son of Africa was Chief Buthelezi's uncle, Prince Buthelezi's uncle. And they speak to Prince Buthelezi's life in a prophetic way. Prince Buthelezi is a son of Africa who has been proved through fire and sword and was part of the generation of leaders that marched to the golden door and ushered in a better future for South Africa and indeed for Africa. Allow me to put these words in their historical context. Mr. Sema was speaking at a time when the Western Empire were at their peak and colonialism was well entrenched on the African continent. Despite the subjugation of the peoples of Africa, their spirit was not crushed. The European age of empire is littered with examples of Africa's undying spirit. Just 27 years prior to Mr. Seme's speech, the Battle of Isandiwana took place. In that battle, King Setshiwayo delivered a resounding victory for the Zulu kingdom and the African people. The Zulu forces out-soldiered the British Army, camped at the foot of the Isandiwana mountain. The impi cried Usuthu and urged forward in what was a battle for their most prized possession, the land of their forefathers. They delivered to the British one of the worst defeats in the history of their colonial expansion. I bring up this battle not only because it was a great victory for the Zulu people, but because the events of that day will foreshadow the century to come, with the spirit of the Zulu warriors being called on time and again. After the defeat of British Empire the British Empire took a more aggressive approach, deploying more soldiers and ending any hopes that King Setshiwayo had of a negotiated peace. In the year that followed, the apartheid government will face this same fighting spirit and choosing to meet this spirit for freedom with bullets and violence, and for decades refused to pursue a negotiated settlement. At the time of this British invasion, Prince Buthelezi's grandfather, Nyamano Buthelezi, was Prime Minister to King Setshiwayo, a role his father, Mathole, also provided to the Zulu royal family. It is through his mother, the daughter of King Dinusulu, Princess Magogo Kadisulu, that Chief Buthelezi called Pixeli Kasema his uncle. Through his mother, he had the spirit of the Zulu monarchy that fiercely fought British colonialism. And through his father, he had the spirit of selfless service to a cause of justice and human dignity. In addition, the spirit of a revolutionary can also be found in Prince Buthelezi. In 1912, his uncle, Pixeli Kaseme, became one of the founding fathers of the South African Native National Congress, SANNC, that gigantic fighter for freedom that will later become known as the African National Congress, ANC. His grandfather, King Dinusulu, was bestowed the greatest honor of being crowned the honorary president of the ANC. Distinguished guests, in the context of war and conflict, the first casualty is truth. These strong ties that Prince Buthelezi's family had with the ANC was a fact that will be forgotten in the 1980s and 1990s, especially by those who wished to drive a divisive narrative among the ranks of the oppressed people of South Africa. I bring up these family relations because these were the people who surrounded a young Prince Buthelezi in his formative years, and who undoubtedly strengthened and shaped the man we have today. While it was an accident of birth that Prince Buthelezi found himself born into a family and community that was this illustrious, it also means that it was only natural that he would be counted among those who played a leading role in the struggle for the restoration of dignity for the people of Africa. I think we can all agree that Prince Buthelezi did not disappoint his forebears or their spirit of refusing to succumb to subjugation, and that he truly embodied their spirit throughout the various stages of his political life. It was at the University of Fort Hare, one of the bastions of African leadership, that Prince Buthelezi began to make his mark in history. Together with his comrades in the ANC Youth League, they were not disheartened by the 1948 electoral victory of the National Party and the implementation of the system of apartheid. If anything, they saw this as the most opportune time to agitate, mobilize, and organize under the clarion call of freedom in our lifetime. He rubbed shoulders with some of the giants from our continent, such as Dr. Z.K. Matthews, Mr. Robert Sobukwe, and former President Robert Mugabe. Meeting and interacting with such leaders could only have a positive impact on an individual, and must have provided a better education than one would have received in the halls of any university anywhere in the world. Unfortunately, due to his political activism, Prince Buthelezi was not able to complete his studies at Fort Hare. Through this action, Prince Buthelezi showed his commitment for putting the good of the people ahead of his own needs, and a strong desire to right the wrongs of an oppressive system, despite it costing him his place at university. Even at a young age, Prince Buthelezi displayed a bravery that many people spend their whole lives searching for. Indeed, it can only be an act of bravery and uncommon commitment to jeopardize one's future to take such a strong moral stand. And in that act of bravery, Prince Buthelezi inspired others to follow in his footsteps. Prince Buthelezi's life was to be filled with moments of bravery. Following his expulsion from Fort Hare, Prince Buthelezi completed He studies at the non-European section of the University of Natal and was ultimately allowed to graduate at the University of Fort Hare. While in Durban, Prince Buthelezi had the honor of being mentored by Chief Albert Luthuli, Africa's first Nobel Peace Prize recipient, and a man who continues to command respect the world over. Prince Buthelezi also forged friendships with the stalwarts of the South African struggle, such as Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Nelson Mandela, as he continued his political activities. Despite being engaged in political activism in Durban and preparing to undertake his legal articles, Prince Buthelezi was summoned to take on his hereditary position as Nkosi of the Buthelezi clan, which took him back to his home in Malabasini and away from Durban. Once again, the prince showed a willingness to make the sacrifices that were asked of him as a leader. The role and Nkosi ties one to the prosperity of the people who fall under the authority of that Nkosi. In spite of his young age, Prince Buthelezi rose to the occasion and assumed the role of a protector and an advocate for his people. To be an Nkosi is no small undertaking, and to be one during the dark days of apartheid and with a government that was hostile to the legitimacy of such a position made the responsibility much harder. But such daunting circumstances did not deter Prince Buthelezi from the obligations thrust upon him. Indeed, an easier path would have been to shirk these responsibilities in favor of furthering his professional aspirations in Durban. Prince Buthelezi, however, recognized the importance of traditional leadership structures, which needed to be preserved and cultivated. It would have been tempting to continue to protest against the apartheid government from the comfort of urban areas, where access to resources was far greater and the impact of action likely to be far larger. But if one was not prepared to preserve traditional mechanisms of leadership and use them as instruments of political transformation, then centuries-long fight against colonialism and Western imperialism would have been in vain. By taking up the role of Nkosi, Prince Buthelezi was saying, I am an African and these are our ways. Distinguished guests, decades later, Prince Buthelezi was once more called upon to serve in another capacity as leader of the then Kwazulu homeland. Prince Buthelezi was elected by the Amakosi to lead what was, in essence, an attempt by the apartheid government to further drive a wedge within the oppressed peoples of South Africa and absolve itself of any obligation to care for the welfare of the majority of the population. Debates raged at the time about how best to handle apartheid's homeland system. Most of those who took up leadership positions in the homeland structure were branded as puppets of the apartheid regime, anti-revolutionaries, and enemies of progress. Accusations, I am sure, Prince Buthelezi had more than once. He was, at a stage, ostracized by the OAU. He was buffeted left, right, and center by the apartheid regime, the ANC, and the OAU. By creating the homelands along vague ethnic lines, the apartheid regime attempted to dilute any united black response to bring about effective change in South Africa. It cannot be denied that the position of Chief Executive Officer of the Zulu Territorial Authority was created by the apartheid government, which until then was alien to the Zulu people. Therefore, accepting this position must not be taken out of its historical context. I can imagine that many people have considered that serving as the leader of Kwazulu afforded Prince Buthelezi the opportunity to undermine the system of apartheid from within, and that he did. It was in the context of these trying times that the bonds of friendship were forged between myself and the prince. I remember the day back in 1976, as though it was yesterday, when I hosted him in Nigeria. And let me just give the background to that historic visit to Nigeria. As I said earlier, AU has passed a resolution that we should have nothing to do with either Prince Buthelezi or Nkatha. As a responsible member of OAU, I had to, and as leader of Nigeria, we have to obey the resolution of AU. But at the same time, I wanted to have Prince Buthelezi in Nigeria. I couldn't directly and personally invite him, so I got the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, which is a semi-autonomous government organization, to invite him to come and give a lecture. And he accepted to come. Of course, he could not come without paying me a courtesy call. And me receiving him paying me a courtesy call is not at my own invitation. So he came, he gave his lecture, and he acquitted himself at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. And then, of course, he called on me. And he made me to understand a lot more than met the eyes through our discussion. Therefore, accepting this position must not be taken out of its historical context. And as I said, his presence in my country and his absence from South Africa, which also that occasion afforded him the opportunity to avoid attending the institutionalization of the so-called independent homelands. So with one stone, we were able to kill two birds. We were able to have him in Nigeria, and we were able to have him absent in South Africa when he should be absent in South Africa. The Nigerian Institute, as I said, was used as an instrument or medium of getting Prince Buthelezi to Nigeria without us running foul of the OAU resolution. Another thing that is important was his willingness to honor our invitation with the full knowledge at the time that Nigeria was host to the ANC with former President Thabo Mbeki as its chief representative in Nigeria only attests to how he understood his place in history and how he regarded his relations with the broader liberation movement. The 1980s was a tumultuous period the world over. There was the Chernobyl disaster, famine in Ethiopia, war in Sudan and Uganda, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet bloc. While all of this was happening at the bottom of South Africa, the apartheid government desperately clung to power as resistance in South Africa reached a crescendo. The Ciskei became the fourth Bantustan to declare independence from South Africa, and those who operated in the homeland system faced increased criticism. The ANC General Secretary, Alfred Inso, criticized those who worked in the Bantustan system as having betrayed the sacred interest of the people. Despite having the opportunity to declare Kwazulu as an independent state, Prince Buthelezi refused to do so, thus demonstrating his commitment to the struggle, not only in Kwazulu, but for the whole of South Africa, recognizing that freedom in Kwazulu could only be achieved with freedom in South Africa as a whole. So committed was Prince Buthelezi to a free South Africa that when then President Botha offered the prince the independence of KwaZulu, he rejected it in all its entirety. Despite the pressure of living and being a leader during the apartheid era and the growing criticism that the ANC, a partner in the struggle for the dignity of Africa, was leveling at Prince Buthelezi, he had the bravery and the strength of character to continue down the path of freedom and had the foresight to know that KwaZulu independence would be judged poorly by posterity. In this context, it is regrettable that in the 1980s, we saw the build-up and the intensification of tension between ANC and Prince Buthelezi's Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP. This reality was lamentable for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because both Inkatha and ANC were in pursuit of similar strategic political outcomes, albeit with different tactical approaches. The 1980s, more than any other period, tested the commitment of the liberation movements to a united non-racial South Africa. A semi-state of emergency, followed by a full state of emergency declared by the apartheid government, was a desperate response to an escalating crisis for the apartheid regime. The violence in South Africa escalated during the decade, and the need for strong leadership grew with every bullet that was fired. The 1980s in South Africa is a period I remember well. I do not know if you recall, but I visited South Africa in 1986 as a member of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group. And as I always say, well, that group of 7 of us from the Commonwealth, there really wasn't anything eminent except that we give ourselves that name and then that makes it. At the time, the international community was still grappling with its response to apartheid. I visited former President Mandela on Portsmouth Prison, and I had a long discussion with him. And of course, we realized that the room they have prepared for us to meet must have been booked. So he realized that, I realized that. He came to meet me because I was in the room before him, dressed with the ANC belt on a t-shirt. And we were able to communicate, knowing that he would be sending a message, not through me, but through the machine that they have used to bug the place. And our discussion went on, and he said, well, if I'm released, I should not continue to be a problem. I should be part of solution. Then I said to him, my dear brother, when you leave prison, not if, it is when you leave prison, your problem will not be resolution of racial differences, but also resolution of ethnic differences as well. And Nelson Mandela got me perfectly and said, oh, you are referring to Comrade Buthelezi. He is a freedom fighter in his own right. He didn't stop there. He said the means are different, but the objectives are the same. Then I asked, can I give this message to him? He said, please do. And when I came out of the place, I came to my brother. I said, I got a message for you from your brother in prison. I said, what is the message? I told him. He said, did he really say that? I said, he said it. Not only did he say it, he even said, I should mention it to you. I should say it to you. What I'm trying to say here, despite the narrative surrounding Prince Buthelezi at the time, Nelson Mandela knew who Prince Buthelezi was and knew that at his core, when one looks at Prince Buthelezi, one sees a committed fighter for greater freedom in South Africa. I learned a good lesson from that position of Madiba, and I reported, as I said, to my brother. During the period that IFP and ANC had their issues, Mandela never questioned the genuineness and the authenticity of Buthelezi as a committed freedom fighter. During my visit in 1986, the group, that is the Eminent Persons Group, also met with members of the apartheid government, and what we ultimately found was a government that was politically stubborn. For instance, we met the president, who, in addressing us, came out with two big files. Obviously, one on Malcolm Fraser, the former Australian president, who was co-chair, and one on me and Nigeria. And then, when we were about to talk to him, he took the floor, and he was telling the story of what the white in Australia did to the Australian natives. And he went from that to me and said, what I did in Biafra. And I said, Mr. President, when we come to talk about Nigeria, you can say anything, but here now we are talking about South Africa, and I will not take that from you. He kept quiet. Where else? Prince Buthelezi continued to hold a principled stance of refusing to enter any negotiation with the government until Mandela and other political prisoners were released from jail. He recognized how paramount African unity was to the negotiation. He had the wisdom to see that unless Mandela and the ANC were free and able to participate in the negotiation, that process will not be sustainable. If the 1980s were a complicated time, the 1990s would prove to be just as challenging. The negotiations were not easy, and violence persisted. What we saw, among other things, was not only the intensification of attempts to end apartheid through negotiation, but a contestation of ideas for the future of South Africa and fighting for supremacy in a new order. In 1954, Chief Lusuli has said, and I quote, "We meet here to express our deep resentment at the claim made by South Africa through its governments and parliament since the Union to determine and shape our destiny without consulting our wishes, and arrogantly to assign us a position of permanent inferiority in our land, contrary to the plan and purpose of God, our Creator, who created all men equal, and into us too, not to whites only. He breathed the divine spirit of human dignity. And so, we have every human and moral right to resist laws and policies which create a climate inimical to the full development of our personalities as individuals and as our development as a people." End of quote. These words are a demonstration of Nkosi Albert Lutuli's strong sense of Christian faith, which often informed his political activism. Nkosi Albert Lutuli set an example of demonstrating his Christian faith by devoting himself to the betterment of mankind and relentlessly fighting for the liberation of South Africa and Africa in general. This is an example that I believe Prince Buthelezi had followed well. I believe that his Christian faith, among other things, served him well during the final years of apartheid. The negotiations and the infancy of South Africa's democracy, when he was called upon to be part of the process that sought to choose forgiveness over punishment and reconciliation over vengeance. The fact that South Africa did not descend into a full-scale civil war during the 1990s is one of the true miracles of our time. Chief Buthelezi must be commended for his resistance to escalating tensions with the ANC. Not only did Prince Buthelezi balk at the thought of civil war, but he was more than ready to sit around the table and offer his wisdom for the establishment of a new South Africa. The future that South Africa needed was one of reconciliation of all races and all tribal groups, as without reconciliation, the development of a national will will have been almost impossible, and democratic values will have been hard to establish. By sitting around the table with the oppressive apartheid government, the ANC, and other political formations, Prince Buthelezi was already demonstrating his capacity for reconciliation and a great maturity to put personal differences aside for the good of the wider community. The negotiation called for great leaders, and thankfully, there were people, such as Prince Buthelezi, to answer that call along with some of his colleagues. While being able to sit across the table, Prince Buthelezi also exhibited a position of principles during the negotiation, while some might say were disruptive to the negotiations. while others will see it for what it was, a man dedicated to the people he served. I talk, of course, of the Prince's insistence on Isilo, the Zulu monarchy, being part of the negotiation. During the negotiation, Prince Buthelezi exhibited a capacity for compromise, but as accepting that South Africa would not be a federal state system in which provinces will hold greater power. However, on the issue of traditional leadership, Prince Buthelezi took a principled stance. Today, experts write books and journal articles and hold seminars after seminar on the role that traditional leaders play in peace processes and conflict prevention in Africa. It seems that Prince Buthelezi was well ahead of today's academics. Prince Buthelezi recognized the importance that traditional leaders play in situations such as South Africa faced in the 1990s. Traditional leaders, and in his case, the Zulu king, had the unique ability to represent whole societies and communities during negotiation, and the ability to sway public opinion one way or the other. Traditional leaders carry the spirit of generations gone by as custodians of a whole culture and people. Even outside of the continent, we see European kings and queens continuing to be held in high regard and to be seen as leaders of nations, despite many no longer having any constitutional or legal authority. In the case of some, the rest of the world are told to look on European monarchies as world leaders and are made to pay attention to what they say. That is because monarchies bind people together as a nation, an ability more powerful than anything that can be found in law or written down on any piece of paper. After all is said and done, the negotiation produced a democracy for all South Africans to be proud of, and in fact, a democracy that all of Africa could celebrate. I mentioned earlier that South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy and the avoiding of full-scale civil war, which would, in any other circumstances, have been an inevitability, was a miracle. But let me say it again, because it really was an awe-inspiring achievement. This miracle, however, did not just happen. It required patience, commitment, strong leadership, and a true desire for peace from all parties involved. It was a great act of providence that South Africa was blessed with so many leaders who were all active at the same time and who were able to exhibit the requisite qualities that produced South Africa's democracy. whether people want to cast Prince Buthelezi as the villain, or in the story, or not, it cannot be denied that he was a significant player during a crucial period of South Africa's, and indeed the world's history. Most leaders, after a life dedicated to the struggle and liberation of his or her people, followed by a tumultuous period of negotiation, clouded in violence, bringing the country to the brink of civil war. But this case ultimately led to the advent of democracy in South Africa, might retire to the rolling hills of Kwazulu Natal and enjoy some well-deserved rest. But Prince Buthelezi was not done just yet. Having fought so hard for the liberation of South Africa, Prince Buthelezi became an active participant in the democracy he helped to shape. Prince Buthelezi was also not done providing us with examples of servant leadership and exhibiting his capacity for reconciliation. During the visit of Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group that I mentioned earlier in 1986, I asked Prince Buthelezi, what was goading you on? Without hesitation, he replied, interest of all people of South Africa. And I said to him, we are all with you. When thinking of reconciliation in South Africa, most people, and rightly so, will talk about the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The great achievement of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission cannot be denied, and Archbishop Tutu's leadership can only be looked on with awe and respect. A lesser celebrated aspect of South Africa's reconciliation efforts, however, was the government of national unity. As the Minister of Home Affairs, the government of national unity called on Prince Buthelezi to work side by side with other leaders. The ability to forge reconciliation with political adversaries and work together in the same government is not a gesture that posterity should overlook. This government existed at a time when not only South Africans' expectations were high, but the whole world was watching the country's progress with bated breath. Will it or will it not? Not only did the government of national unity not collapse, it showed South Africans that as a nation, they will work together to build a better future, and that those who were once enemies are capable of working together almost seamlessly for the good of the people. This is a great example for many countries in Africa, and indeed the world as a whole, who find themselves in a similar position to South Africa in the 1990s. Schengen. I recall vividly the time when you were once more called upon to show great leadership. When I lead an African observation mission for the 2009 election in South Africa under the auspices of the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes. You exhibited great statesmanship by leading your party towards accepting the electoral outcome, resulting in a smooth transfer of political power in a province where people had seen much suffering and pain. You accepted defeat gallantly and cooperatively in the best interest of the people. You eschewed violence and disorder. Ladies and gentlemen, while South Africa was able to avoid a civil war, many countries in Africa have not been so lucky, including my own country, Nigeria. What we very often see develop in many cases is a cycle of conflict, and issues remain unresolved, and leaders find it difficult to cooperate with those who yesterday they saw as enemies. Many leaders, be it at the national or local levels, find it hard to reconcile with their opponents and difficult to work with them, even if they have signed a peace agreement that has ended the conflict. All too often, people seek to assert their dominance over their rivals instead of seeing an opportunity to work together for the good of the people they profess to serve. It is true that once a conflict is brought to an end, the real work begins. Key to preventing another conflict from occurring is addressing people's needs, providing basic services, addressing the root causes of the conflict, and making sure that people's expectations of peace are met. If their expectations are not met, then further conflict is bound to occur. Prince Buthelezi, by serving in the government of national unity, was key to contributing to South Africa's expectations for peace. We must do more to promote such actions on the continent. I believe that if more leaders in Africa had the strength and foresight of Prince Buthelezi, then Africa might be able to free itself of the shackles of conflict. Then we will be able to silence the gun. Brothers and sisters, it is only by working with our political adversaries or enemies that our enemies become our friends and partners for peace. It is only through reconciliation that peace can be sustained. If there's any life that proves the veracity of these two statements, It is the life that Prince Buthelezi had lived. To learn more about his life is to learn more about strong moral leadership, committed to principles, dedication to the people he serves and leads, and what it truly means to possess the traits of courage, bravery, and integrity. Prince Buthelezi has the misfortune of being born during the trying times, but the great fortune to walk among giants and the ability to become one himself. In this context, the Zulu nation, South Africa, and the African continent as a whole must continue to hold you in high regard. My senior brother, my friend, my prince, and an African leader I admire, I hold you in very high regard. You started your political life as ANC. Actually, ANC, member of ANC Youth League. You struggle separately later, but together, as already I've mentioned in my encounter with Nelson Mandela in Portsmouth prison. And you formed, or you were part of the government of national unity. So, what came out is that the objective was achieved, but by different means, as Nelson Mandela put it. Now I hope we will be able to see IFP and ANC togetherness in the not too distant future. As we know today, the objective of dealing with apartheid has been achieved. But the objective of welfare and well-being of the people of South Africa has not been achieved. For that objective, we need commonality of means, not different means. So, I believe that you and your colleagues of old, when you meet beyond the veil, there will be a great reunion. And that reunion will be, hey, welcome, Prince Buthelezi. How did you leave things at home? And you will be able to say to them, I've made things better when you left. As I conclude, allow me to once more still and then slightly amend your words and say, when a leader reaches a certain age, people often talk about their legacy. The Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi Foundation has been established to preserve your legacy in all the roles you have played in your very eventful life. You have rolled into one life, almost 5 or 6 different lives, into one. That's special gift by God to you. I envy you. Eventful life as an activist, young student activist, a traditional prime minister to the Zulu monarchy and nation, a negotiator, acting president of the republic, member of parliament, minister of home affairs, chief minister of the former Kwazulu government, a liberation stalwart, and a freedom fighter in your own right. Chancellor of the University of Zululand, a conservationist, and a man who fears God, a transformational African leader, and a true servant of his people. My dear brother, senior brother, I was looking at everything that you have achieved, everything that could be credited to you, and I said, well, look, this my brother is beating me in everything. Could I have anything to beat him in? Then I discover that I have something to beat you in. As I said to President Nelson Mandela at one time, he, myself, and President Kaunda sat down, quietly, the three of us. Then I turned to President Nelson Mandela and I said, Madiba. He said, Olu. That's why he refers to me, my first name, Olu. He said, I said, Madiba, you know, you are senior to me in age and everything, but I am senior to you in one thing. So he said, Olu, what are you senior to me in? I said, President Kaunda and I, we are senior to you. He said, well, what are you and KK senior to me in? I said, you see, you went to prison before you became president. We went to prison after we have been president. So you are a prison graduate. We are prison postgraduate. My dear brother, you have no prison in your record, so I'm senior to you in that. Schengen, your legacy has been cast in gold. It will outlive you through many future generations. But it's not yet a closed book. Your legacy is still being written. The annual lecture will be a series, as I've been told, that is being established today will be part of your written legacy. You are going to leave an enviable heritage. We thank God for the totality of your life. Thank God for your life. Thank you all for listening to me.
I'm a king, go. I think I'm a king, go.